an AppleVis original.
Yeah, and Sarah's a legitimate genius. Like when she's talking to an accessibility audience, it's one thing, but when she shifts focus and talks more broadly, her language adapts. She starts talking about customization and settings and exactly what you said. And that just resonates with people who maybe never thought that, I don't need accessibility. Oh, but I would like to make my fonts a little bolder. I would like to make them a little bigger. And that sort of, I don't want to say it Jedi mind tricks them, but it sort of opens their world to more possibilities. And he had a friend named Doug Russell, and he brought Doug on, and Doug was an accessibility engineer. And he just railed about, companies in the beginning, all they cared about was the code. And then very slowly, thanks a lot to the influence of Apple, they began to care about design. And then when there was an app store and they had to start selling their own apps, they began to care about marketing. But accessibility was always like last on the list, first to be dropped if you had to make a ship date. And how backwards that was, because accessibility made the design better and made the marketing easier. What I liked that Apple did early on was make accessibility mainstream in the way that they would put it up on stage at their biggest events. They would include it in the first releases of their biggest products and talk about it being included. And some companies do some accessibility stuff, but they never talk about it. They don't give it any stage time.
Hello and welcome to the AppleVis Extra podcast. This is episode number 73. My name is Dave Nason. In light of Global Accessibility Awareness Day last week, I thought it would be an idea to bring in somebody to talk to from slightly outside of our usual sort of accessibility bubble, so to speak. Somebody maybe more from the mainstream side of the tech media. And to that end, we are delighted to be welcoming Rene Ritchie, formerly of iMore and the Vector series on YouTube, now independent tech journalist, and somebody certainly who has an interest in accessibility nonetheless. Rene, great to have you. Thanks for joining me on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. And I wanted to ask you, I wanted to invite you on, today because we had Global Accessibility Awareness Day last week. Actually heard you guys talking about it on MacBook Weekly, which is great, always great to hear as well. So in light of that, I always think it's interesting to kind of talk to people from maybe outside of our usual community, I suppose, our kind of little bubble, and see kind of what do people in the mainstream side of things think of accessibility? Like, what does accessibility mean to you as a user and as a journalist?
So I've sort of been assimilated because it's been something that's been brought to the forefront of my attention for 5-6 years now. So I don't know if I'm properly representative of a mainstream view anymore. I was shown early on just the value of accessibility and inclusivity for everybody, and both in a micro and macro level. Like in a micro level where good design is good design and accessibility is accessibility, where when you make your products more considerate, it absolutely helps people in the accessibility community, but it makes the design better for everybody. It makes it more obvious. It makes it more intuitive. And there are so many features that just started out with, just for example, at Apple with the accessibility team, that eventually became features that went across the entire OS. But more specifically, it's one of those things where I don't think you think about it this way, but everybody needs this stuff eventually. And maybe it's because you go to the eye doctor and they dilate your pupils, or something happens like and you're near loud noise and you temporarily lose hearing, or you fall and you bust your arm or you bust your leg. Something happens, or just, I'm at that age now where a lot of my friends are turning on display zoom, not because they always needed it, but because they need it now. And those features are there to support you. And last week, wow, were you callous and uncaring about them? But this week, now you depend on them. They are life-saving, and you can't believe that you didn't realize their value sooner.
Absolutely agree. And actually, they have a line, if you open up like the accessibility section of settings, it kind of describes it as these accessibility features help you to customize your iPhone to suit your needs. So it's kind of And I complimented. We spoke to Sarah Herlinger last year, who from Apple, and I complimented her on that and she said, "Thank you, I wrote that." But she was saying, "Yeah, that's it. That's absolutely it." And I'm a big fan of using the word universal design in a sense, rather than just accessibility, because like you say, it's for everybody.
Yeah, and Sarah's a legitimate genius. Like when she's talking to an accessibility audience, it's one thing, but when she shifts focus and talks more broadly, her language adapts. She starts talking about customization and settings and exactly what you said, and that just resonates with people who maybe never thought that I don't need accessibility. Oh, but I would like to make my fonts a little bolder. I would like to make them a little bigger, and that sort of, I don't want to say it Jedi mind tricks them, but it sort of opens their world to more possibilities.
Absolutely. Do you think I wonder about this even in my own job, is there a stigma around the word accessibility almost sometimes still? So people might have sight issues, but they don't consider themselves to be part of any sort of disability group. So maybe they don't open that section of settings. And is that a huge part of what we as a community and people like Apple have to do to sort of educate people?
Yeah, I don't know if it's a stigma as much of it as it might be an ignorance. And I know the word ignorance has become more problematic, but I mean it in like the classical sense that we don't know any better. And we don't even know these options exist. And maybe you don't consider yourself like what your stereotype would be. Like, I don't have no vision. I don't have no hearing, but it's just, I'm holding things a little further away or a little nearer. And you don't stop to think that it really is like, if your door was only 3 feet high, you'd be stooping to get under it all the time. Making doors 7 feet tall is better for more people. And it's really just that. It's opening up the boundaries of design so that it is more considerate of a wider group of people. And you will eventually hit, if you don't care about it, you will eventually hit up against one of those edges that's not quite wide enough for you.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's amazing how often people don't know these things exist until they need to know they exist. Yeah. I think, yeah, absolutely. When would you say then, would you have kind of been enlightened by it, or when would you have come across it for the first time in your world?
So there were two incidents that really stick out to me. And one was I was doing a podcast called Iterate, all about mobile design with Mark Edwards and Seth Clifford. And we had a bunch of designers on. And one of the designers we had on was Dave Wiskus, who I think at the time was still with Black Pixel. I'm not positive, but he might have still been with Black Pixel. And he had a friend named Doug Russell, and he brought Doug on, and Doug was an accessibility engineer. And he just railed about, companies in the beginning, all they cared about was the code. And then very slowly, thanks a lot to the influence of Apple, they began to care about design. And then when there was an app store and they had to start selling their own apps, they began to care about marketing. But accessibility was always like last on the list, first to be dropped if you had to make a ship date. And how backwards that was, because accessibility made the design better and made the marketing easier. And he would single out companies that were really good at it. He would single out companies that were really bad at it. He eventually worked on the Mac accessibility team for many years at Apple. And he really opened my mind to how important it was right from the very minute you started thinking about building an app. And then a little while later, I got to talk to Sarah again. And it was, I think, the first time I spoke with her. And it wasn't in public. It was just, for my edification. But she spoke about how Apple was making the camera accessible in terms of like, maybe if you have low or no vision, people think, oh, you don't need a camera. And that was what was happening with cameras for decades. People just thought, oh, low and no vision, you don't need a camera. And Apple realized that no, you want to take selfies too. And maybe you don't see them or you don't see them well, but you want to send them to your family and to your friends and all these other people because, they care about you the same way you care about them. And they began building these features in to say, face not in center or lighting, like all these voiceover features to help people with low or no vision take better selfies. And that was just so mind expanding to me, both in terms of how Apple looked at the technology and how much of a difference it could make. Not necessarily like, I think some people are used to accessibility being literally, it has to be life or death every time, but quality of life is so important as well. And just because like it's an accessibility feature doesn't mean it's frivolous. It means like you deserve every bit of the best experience possible, just like everybody else.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can all still go through those kind of moments as well. Because even for me, I sometimes tell the story of when being just absolutely wowed when Apple, with the Apple Watch, introduced wheelchair mode. Yeah. And I kind of thought, that never occurred to me. You know what I mean? I'm one of the people, I'm an accessibility advocate. And yeah, I was blown away by, oh my God, of course they need to exercise the same as I do.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And Apple kind of thought of that and brought this really innovative feature. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I would have thought, and we get accused here sometimes, I suppose, of being too in favor of Apple sort of thing, yourself. Yeah. But I would say that Apple have sort of led the way in the mainstream side of the tech industry, probably since 10 years ago, 11 years ago now, since VoiceOver particularly. Would you kind of agree with that? Would you say Apple have kind of led the industry and that the industry has successfully followed?
What I liked that Apple did early on was make accessibility mainstream in the way that they would put it up on stage at their biggest events. They would include it in the first releases of their biggest products and talk about it being included. And some companies do some accessibility stuff, but they never talk about it. They don't give it any stage time. And some people in the community might be aware of it, but there's so many more people who could benefit from it. And there's so many other developers who just need to hear that message. If you're sitting in the WWDC audience or watching the stream and Apple's devoting 5 minutes, 5 incredibly precious, valuable minutes of a keynote to talking about an accessibility feature. And now they do that multiple times every keynote. But they started, Scott Forstall famously had a whole segment on accessibility very early on for iOS. And Google didn't do that. And Microsoft didn't do that. And Amazon didn't do that. And that to me was just them talking about it sets fire to it. It means all of a sudden everybody is aware of it. And maybe they'll ignore it. Maybe it's not that interesting to them. But there will be some people like, oh, wow, I never knew this could be done. Or developers going, oh, Apple's devoting all these resources to it. Maybe I should think about it. Or when they do collections in the App Store for accessibility apps, which Google and other people are doing now as well, developers want to be in those categories. They want that sort of attention, and it incentivizes them to do it. So I think, credit where credit is due. As we are seeing accessibility get more attention, it's largely because Apple has been making it something that other companies need to keep up with, if not start to compete with.
Yeah, I think you're right. I even look at someone like Microsoft, in a sense, have supported accessibility for 30 plus years or something, you could, supporting screen readers, even they've hooks in the operating system for the likes of JAWS. But it's only in the last few years since Windows 10 that they've had a narrator as an actual fully fledged screen reader built in, where I don't have to go out and pay €1,000 for something. I think for me, that was probably the key thing with Apple. I think they were the first mainstream company to really add it in there, built in for everybody.
And for big features, like I remember so vividly when they introduced something like Siri, or even before Siri, FaceTime, and then they show someone doing sign language over FaceTime, and they introduce Siri, and they show someone with no vision or low vision using Siri to read messages out loud. And then the next WWDC, they have someone using their iPhone for the first time to walk through a forest. And it's so intensely, it is just so affecting to see that. And I don't recall anyone else giving it that kind of attention or being that inclusive to include people using the technologies in that way. And I think that's been partially responsible for a paradigm shift.
Yeah, and it's actually that confidence as well that I know if Apple announced a new product now, when they announced the Apple Watch back in 2014, I kind of knew there and then I can be in the queue day one and it'll work.
Yeah.
I didn't have to kind of worry about, will I be able to use this, which I think is amazing.
And I think some people don't realize or haven't experienced this, but especially when I worked at iMore, every time there was a new product or update, there would be people in the accessibility community nervous that this would be the update that would take something away from them, because they always thought that they were last on the list, that it was it was just some form of grace that they were getting the features that they were getting and they could be gone any minute, or the next product could come out, like maybe the touch bar would come out or the new Apple TV, or, and it wouldn't be accessible. And I think that's because that community has been burned just so often. And it took sort of years and years of good faith. And even now, I think they're still some of the first people to jump on and say, hey, wait a minute, this isn't quite right. And Apple has to be responsive enough, because it is a community that is dependent on these technologies, not just release after release, but day after day.
Absolutely. And we absolutely have those fears. And when I think of some of the stuff that's coming down the line in our specific community, voice first kind of OSs are obviously something that we think, well, that sounds fantastic for our particular community. Yeah. But then things like AR kind of strike fear in us. But then I guess we just have to hope that, these amazing people and technicians are thinking about that too.
Yeah. Or the tactility, like the Taptic engine, how far could that, like Nintendo was making it like you could feel ice cubes in the Switch controllers, and Apple was doing very fine grained touch response. And that has so much potential that hasn't really been exploited yet. But it does seem like AirPods are very, very audio centric. And if Apple glasses are true, those sound like they'll be very video centric. And the tactile stuff is very, touch sense centric. And in some ways it's fragmenting, but I hope someone is paying attention above all of those things to make sure that if every component is separate, at least the overall picture is still inclusive.
Yeah, you can still use them anyway, hopefully. In line with, actually, you did a video recently where you said, are smartphones now good enough? To which you said absolutely no. In a similar light, is Apple doing enough when it comes to accessibility?
I think that's a two-edged sword. Like, they are doing things still that at least I don't expect. Maybe other people do expect them, but I still watch like WWDC and I see things like voice control, I think was far more mature than what I expected them to deliver. Like it's far from perfect. It needs a ton of work, but it was on every platform all at once. And it had much more functionality than I envisioned for version 1. So in that sense, they're exceeding my expectations. But there are still things like, I know Steve Aquino, who's been writing about accessibility forever, will still come across like some section of the App Store app that's not accessible for him. And that this is like 10 years post App Store, or there'll be some view or something will be rendered, or there'll be some frame buffer for acceleration that makes it inaccessible. Or some app still hasn't bothered to do accessibility. And then I feel like we're still at step 1.
Yeah, and we've asked Apple about that kind of stuff. The third-party developer stuff, I think, is still a huge area. And I know Apple have their reasons why they don't have it as a requirement, I suppose, for the App Store, because there's no such thing as this is accessible or this is not accessible. It's it's not as black and white as that, I guess. But do you think it would be realistic, or how do you think developers would react to a level of accessibility being required for entry into the App Store? Do you think that's something that could fly yourself?
Yeah, I think it's like a carrot and a stick approach. And I think Apple has been pretty good with the carrot part, which is just like, please use UIKit controls whenever possible. And if you do, you get accessibility. The cliche is quote unquote for free. It's not free. You still have to be thoughtful about it, but you get so many things like VoiceOver, like all the labels for VoiceOver, but also you get like just now you get cursor support, like proper full-on cursor support. The people who best implemented their interfaces for accessibility are the ones getting the best support for cursor now. That's a huge advantage to them. The stick, I think, could be a little stronger, where there are basic requirements, like they don't allow, you would never get like a Windows 98 era interface into the App Store. And I think you shouldn't be able to get a circa 2010 level like lack of accessibility into the App Store either.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. You're right as well about the packaging. I think we talked about that with voice control last year when it was announced that it's essentially using all the same or a large number of the same features that VoiceOver is. So if somebody looked at that voice control demo at WWDC and said, that looks amazing, I want that in my app, we were going to benefit in the VoiceOver using community as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is great. Do you work with or deal with third-party developers very often, or do you have much of a sense of kind of how they, the ones kind of feel about accessibility? And is it something that's important to many that you would deal with?
I did, especially when there weren't very many people at iMore. I talked to them every day because I had to cover apps every day before we got more people who could help with the app coverage. And I think it really varies. Like you have people like the Icon Factory who are doing amazing accessibility, at least based on what I understand and what I see and how often I hear them talking about it, they really care deeply about it and they implement it very, very well. And there are the kind of people who hire accessibility consultants and who do all of that extra work. They're doing it really well. Then there are some people who, like, I don't even think it's an afterthought. It's just not even a thought, and they're busy. I don't want to stereotype them, but it's often people who do cross-platform, things, maybe games, but maybe, social things that just, like Twitter today had an announcement on their descriptions for images, and it's been, I don't know how many years, and, they're announcing it today, and great that they announced it today, but it's been a really, really long time. And I think those are often the people who don't use Apple's native kits and then don't bother to do the work themselves otherwise.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Those cross-platform people are using engines and things like that to build more quickly for multiple platforms. It's definitely a challenge. You're right. It's funny actually. I find sometimes when I feed back to companies about accessibility, sometimes I have more success the smaller the company. Yeah. The larger the organization, the bigger a job it is for them to turn everything around and add it to the roadmaps and all that kind of stuff. I remember contacting the likes of David Smith, who develops Pedestrian++, and within a week he had me on a beta build, and within a month he had the voiceover supported, app in the App Store.
He's amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. So how would you feel about users then? Would you kind of tips if you kind of put yourself in developer kind of shoes, in a sense of how to approach people if you're a user and you're having frustrations with an app?
I think, it always depends on, because some of them are just, again, ignorant. They just don't know that is there and that they should be supporting it. And maybe they even use UIKit and they could support it. They just don't know about it. So I think it's always, I set this rule for myself where I try to start off every day like Mr. Rogers. And, maybe I'll end up being Homer Simpson and maybe I'll end up being John Wick, but I want to start every day as Mr. Rogers. So I want to start, and I have spoken to developers about it. And some of them are like, oh, I didn't know. I really thank you for bringing this to my attention. They could not be happier to hear about the extra functionality and the benefits they can provide their customers and, all the things that come from really well implementing this stuff. And there are others who just do not care at all. They're like, who cares about that? And those, that's when I turn into John Wick more often. But somewhere in between is usually most people. And if you can explain to them, either they don't know about it and it's easy for them to do, or they've heard about it, but they're worried that it's a lot of work, and you can assuage those worries by telling them how much of it they just get built in. Or, if it is a little bit of work for them and you can help them understand the benefits of implementing it for accessibility, but also for all the other, how much easier it makes implementing everything else, then I think if they're willing to have that conversation, you can usually win them over.
Yeah. And I find actually often that person who just didn't know before becomes one of your greatest advocates, one of the most passionate people. Once they sort of embrace it, often they really run with it. I also find actually sometimes phase one is talking about, putting labels on things and that kind of thing correctly. Yeah. And phase two is where they kind of come in and think of the user experience, going beyond just the simple kind of side of it.
And the accessibility community is amazing. They're incredibly loyal and they reward that kind of work with an incredible amount of support. And I don't think anybody who understands the community would want anything but that from them.
True, actually, yeah, the community does act in that way. You mentioned Icon Factory. Everybody uses Twitterific, it seems to me anyway, because you kind of recognize that when somebody's really trying to do it well, you really want to reward it as well. To move then a little bit on, I would wondered curiously, have you ever watched a show with audio description, or do you kind of have much of a sense of kind of what it's like to be a consumer in that sense, or have you tried it?
I've tried almost every accessibility feature for, I can't say extended periods of time because, a lot of people have no choice in how long they use it for, but I've used them all. So I've listened to descriptive audio, and I've used voiceover, and I've used the switches and all those kinds of things. I don't understand them the way that somebody who just uses them every day do, but I try to make sure I at least understand the mechanics of how they work. And it really is a very different experience. It feels almost like it sparks different parts of your brain in terms of how you consume and understand and process information. But I think that's almost like learning another language, where it's like it's a benefit. It expands your ability to think, not just how you think.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's another area, I think we all know how on-demand video and so on is growing so much, and Apple committed to all of their original shows having audio description, having subtitles. And if everybody was able to make those commitments, and that is something that comes at a cost, particularly the audio description more so than subtitles, I would think.
And there's weird outliers. Like someone contacted me a couple of weeks ago, and I put them in touch with some people because some of the shows in Canada weren't subtitled. The Apple versions weren't subtitled, where another network in Canada had the subtitled versions. And that's almost always a result of someone just not sending the files over to the right person. And that kind of stuff can be fixed. So if anybody comes across stuff that, like I encourage people to complain loudly and complain often if you come across something that's not subtitled, especially regionally, because the US will almost always get everything first and the most attention just because the companies are based there and it's just such a huge market. But maybe, a mistake happened in your country or in your language. Just be noisy about it, because it's not going to get fixed or noticed if you're not noisy about it.
Absolutely. One actually that springs to mind as you say that was Star Wars Force Awakens had audio description in the iTunes store in the US and Canada. It did not have it in Ireland or the UK.
Yeah.
It was just like infuriating,
Yeah, absolutely.
What do you think then of Apple TV Plus generally, moving a little bit away from accessibility as the sole topic? Do you think Apple would be happy with Apple TV Plus at this point?
I think it's mixed right now. Like we all know the biggest downside they have is, unlike Netflix and Disney Plus and a lot of their competitors, they don't have a back catalog. And the back catalog's greatest benefit is, okay, I watched the hot new thing. Like I watched the last season of Clone Wars or The Mandalorian, or I watched, the last season of Stranger Things. And now I just want to watch something else. And they have so much something else for you to watch. I think the benefit that Apple TV Plus has, the way they built it though, is like with Disney Plus, they're basically completely brand based. They're Star Wars, they're Magic Kingdom, they're Marvel and Muppets. There are a few major brands, but if you prefer Star Trek, if you prefer DC Comics, if you prefer other brands, they are of no value to you. And even Netflix has a lot of franchise content where Apple started clean. And they've been willing so far to have an amazing diversity of programming. The joke in the beginning, everyone was concerned that Tim Cook and Eddie Kia would never allow, adult programming, for example, or just like more mature programming, for example. And they dispelled that with the morning show and See almost immediately. And a lot of the shows they've put on have been very different from other shows. And they've had a few franchises, but a lot of very new properties. And everyone complains there's no new ideas in Hollywood, but it's letting out some of these new ideas. And not all of them are good. Not all of them are great. Some people like some of them. I like others of them. But I think overall, it's been a really interesting way to get truly original programming and content. And I think that is a net win so far.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually say I love some of the shows I've watched on Apple TV Plus. Like The Morning Show and For All Mankind, Amazing Stories. They're all really good shows. Mythic Quest is another one I really enjoy.
Yeah, I just watched the quarantine episode today. That was
fantastic.
Tremendous.
I'm already looking. It's one of those, like, I've binge watched the whole season and now you have to wait a year or who knows how long for season 2.
Yeah.
But great show. Interestingly, See was probably one I didn't enjoy very much.
Yeah, I mean, they made some odd choices like along the way, but hopefully, it's usually hard to nail the first season of any show, and unfortunately, we're in an era where a lot of shows only get one season. When some of the biggest hits in history only became hits in their second or third season, so I'm hoping a lot of these shows, like The Morning Show, I wasn't sure about at all until I got to the last few episodes. And then those last few episodes were some of the best TV I watched last year. The
finale was one of the best I've seen. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the interesting thing about this, is that I'm raving about these shows to friends and family, but they don't have Apple TV Plus, and in many cases they don't even know what it is. So I think there seems to be a huge knowledge kind of gap there, certainly on this side of the Atlantic anyway, in terms of its availability and what you get.
That's what I was hoping, the free year, because they really didn't have a lot of value for the money in the beginning because there was so few shows. But that free year, I think as long as anybody bought an Apple device, they could get that programming. And I don't know if they're going to have to extend it now because all the second seasons are delayed or double it or whatever. But I think that is the greatest sort of ability they have, is to subsidize users basically on hardware profits for a while.
Yeah. And I suppose maybe it's different in the States. I'm not sure about Canada. Over here, you're probably aware that the share of iPhone it's still quite big. There's a lot of iPhones, but it's not as big. You know, the Android is huge over here. So there's kind of less exposure maybe to it out of the box than
absolutely. Yeah. I've heard some countries like Spain have very, very small iPhone share. So it's going to vary a lot by territory.
Yeah. But I have to say I will keep it even if I have to pay for it. So it's worked for me. We've WWDC coming up next month. Is there anything you're looking forward to from it or from iOS 14 or macOS?
Yeah, I mean, on a couple levels. One is I just want to see logistically how they handle it, because it's going to be so different. It's not the entire Apple developer community going to San Jose for a week, you know, and doing a lot of in-person meetings and labs and meetups and all of those things, including the accessibility meetup, which is almost always one of the best, if not the best meetup every WWDC. There's some of the stuff feels like it's easier to translate, like the keynote has always been streamed. State of the Union has recently been streamed. Even the Apple Design Awards, and most of the sessions are live the same day now, which is amazing. But things like the labs and the meetups and just the serendipitous running into people you hadn't even thought about in years is going to be tough to synthesize.
I'd imagine, yeah. What are the accessibility meetups like, actually? That's something I've always thought I'd love to go to WWDC and see what it's like. What is an accessibility one all about?
They're all broadly similar. So what happens is they basically announce a time and a place, and it's in one of the areas inside the conference center. And they have a bunch of developers who make accessibility apps. And then they have some media people to write about those apps. And they're always amazing. It's like there was... I'm blurring between last year and the year before, but there was the person who figured out how to use an iPhone 10 to map where you were looking at the screen so that you could move the cursor on your Mac just using the TrueDepth camera. And there was someone else who had figured out a way to do such precise turn-by-turn notifications through AirPods that people who were low vision could use them to go out for walks and even runs in the city when they hadn't been able to since they had lost the majority of their vision. Just things that were incredibly enabling, and they would have the developers there so you could talk to them, and they would also have members of the accessibility community. So a bunch of Apple's engineers on the accessibility teams, you know, they're either low vision or low hearing, and they're there to talk. And Apple's PR for accessibility, you know, is part of the accessibility community, and they have a bunch of different marketing people who work on it too. And Sarah's always there, you know, with a group of people. And then you just get a chance to talk to everybody and see what apps are in the works and what sort of needs the community has, what their thoughts are on whatever Apple just announced. Like last year, I think voice control was obviously the big one. You know, everybody was talking about that. And what they like, what they don't like, their first impressions, sort of their concerns, all of that. And it goes on formally, I think, for an hour, but informally, probably for a couple hours until they throw us out. And it's just fascinating to listen to every year.
Yeah, it sounds like fun. Yeah, interesting to see how that translates. I have to, I think you're right. I'm going to try and dial in if I can.
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, it sounds great. Is there anything in iOS 14 or in macOS that you think is the big ticket items this year for them? Or
I mean, there are things that, you know, obviously every year everybody wants a snow leopard year because no matter how, and I think this year most aptly, because I think iOS 13 and macOS Catalina were more painful for people than any other recent, like the iOS 12 and iOS 12 in general was such a smooth beta. It was really rock solid. Amazing, and iOS 13 really was not. And I think just solidifying that. And I understand that Apple is changing things at a very core, very root level, but they still have to ship working software. And my big hope, and I don't know if this will happen, but my big hope is that Apple moves away slowly from these monolithic releases. And instead, when Craig comes out or when Tim says it's shipping this fall, I would much rather they come out and say, this is our roadmap for 2020. And some of it's going to arrive in September and some of it's going to arrive in October and some of it's going to arrive in March. And this is the roadmap for the next year of iOS, because even now, there's been so many features that were pushed back and delayed just because they simply weren't ready. So I would, and I know it's a really competitive environment and everybody wants them to not do anything else except the things they want. Like, just slow down, fix everything, and only do 2-3 features, but they've got to be my 2-3 features, which are different than yours. So I get all that. I just think we're at a point now where everything is mature enough that they could they could move away from those monolithic updates and do things more in a more slow and steady manner.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And it seems like whether by choice or by requirement, they've moved a little bit in that direction, with things sometimes delayed till October, like you say, or there was the cursor support was a big one that I think took a lot of people by surprise this year.
Yeah.
So I think it's going to be certainly an interesting year. And like you say, I don't think that in that video I mentioned earlier about, is it good enough now? It's never good enough. There's always something more that can be done.
Well, I mean, it's just like all time is limited. Like, people used to joke about how it took 3 years to get cut and paste or copy paste on iOS. And then you talk to Apple, you talk to the people at Apple, or Ken Kishinda left Apple, and he's like, I was the only one building the keyboard. And the first year I had to build the keyboard. Second year I had to work on the App Store. And then the third year I got to do copy paste. It's like they have very small teams, and those teams are overloaded. And Apple's culture doesn't work the way a lot of other companies do. And you can't, it's like a mythical person hour. You can't just add resources to everything. It begins to break down the process. So I just find the amount of stuff that you can ship, and then ship that amount of stuff and make it really good. Yeah,
exactly. And I think, bugs are probably what bothered our community more than anything last year.
Yeah.
There's some cool new features, but you kind of feel you need them to be reliable, or you just want to throw it out the window.
Absolutely. Yeah. And fairly so.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's been brilliant talking to you, Rene, and thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me on. I really enjoyed it.
And do you want to tell us actually where they can find you online nowadays?
Sure. So I'm either incredibly consistent or incredibly boring, depending on your point of view, because I'm at Rene Ritchie almost everywhere. I'm youtube.com/Rene Ritchie for the videos, twitter.com, instagram.com/Rene Ritchie for social networks. And I have a website, reneritchie.net, where I put up every video I make, I try to put it up as a podcast, or I do put it up as an audio podcast as well. And I put up the text for it on reneritchie.net. So you can watch it, listen to it, or read it, depending on which way you prefer.
Absolutely. I know we have plenty of people in our community who have hearing loss as well as vision loss, and that kind of thing is amazing, when they can use their braille displays to read that content. So that's amazing. And can I say congratulations on your new venture as well?
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Really enjoying the videos. And so, I'd say definitely recommend going and subscribing. So thank you very much again.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
And thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the AppleVis Extra. To learn more about us, visit our website at www.applevis.com. Follow us on Twitter @AppleVis and like us on Facebook.